On this week's episode of Ears to Hear, we're going to continue our discussion about expediencies. We're going to look at the church building itself in light of this issue. Should a church have a building? Can a church have a building? What pros and cons might there be within this issue of expediencies? Thanks for joining us this week. Again, we appreciate you joining us. Andrew, how are you doing today?
John, I am doing well. It's good to see you.
Yep, good to see you. So we're going to be talking about church buildings.
Yes, continuing the discussion of things that are expedient, whether they are or not.
Yep, okay. So like I said, define it for us once again. What is an expedient?
Right. So I just think of it as, anything that's helpful. Anything that's helpful to try to accomplish, what you need to do.
Right, and that's basically what we said last week. And it's like that's what it is. It's right. Is it beneficial?
And I think combined with we talked about the idea of having a located, I almost said professional preacher, but I guess if you define professional as paid for the work, then fine, professional preacher. We talked about having a located preacher.
We're going to have to rehash all of last week's episode.
No. This isn't a repeat of everything we said, whether it's that or buildings.
Hour 2, here we come.
What I was just thinking was it's good to have these kind of discussions, and it's good to think about these kind of topics, because things like church buildings, things like preachers, those are things where, especially if you grew up around it or if you've just been around it a long time,
you take it for granted.
There are things that are very easy to just assume that's the norm and not really think about it. So it's good to think about these things every now and then.
I think there is one of the exercises that I always encourage people to do. If you were starting a new work somewhere, what would it look like?
Right. Almost approach it as if no one had ever made a church before. What would it take? Turn to God's word and see what would the core building blocks really be.
And I mean, not to, pardon me for starting off with this tangent, but just for example, if you started a new work somewhere, would the first thing you'd be, well, we obviously have to have pews because church buildings have to have pews. You may say, what do we have to have pews for, and go a different route, and the point is, when you look at things like that, it's like you cut through a lot of tradition, you cut through all the traditions, and you go back and you look at Scripture and you say, okay, what are we commanded to do? And then the question is, how can we do that most effectively?
Right.
And that's where expediencies come into it. Because one of the things with expediencies is it has to be beneficial in keeping a commandment. And I mean, we're not talking about, if it doesn't help keep a commandment, then what is it? Then you start doing things that are unlawful and you don't have any authority for it all. So it has to help keep a commandment. So usually the example that people give for expediencies and keeping commandments, it's Noah. And it's usually, God told Noah, go build an ark. Right? The world's going to be destroyed. Build it out of gopher wood. But he did not tell him what tools to use to cut down the trees, to shape the boards. He didn't say use a saw, use an axe, whatever. Okay, so at that point, the point is Noah had to use something.
Sure. And just because you brought up the example of Noah, I mean, that's even a case where he was told to build something, and I would say in greater detail than we see for the building or the existence of churches. He at least had dimensions to work off of.
Yeah. And I will say, I mean, the church, there is a design to the church. It's pretty simple.
Right.
And sometimes people aren't happy with simplicity. But anyway, yeah, he was told in pretty good detail. It's like so many cubits high, cubits long, but the tools were up to him. And whatever was most, I mean, he's going to use the best tool for the job. whatever he's got. Another example in the New Testament, we have the example of, for example, the weekly collection, the offering.
Mm-hmm.
That is the what. And we know from 1 Corinthians chapter 6, what's Paul say? Something like, as I gave orders to the churches in Galatia, so I command you also.
Right.
Or that's 1 Corinthians chapter 16 at verse 1. On the first day of the week, let each one of you lay something aside, storing up as he may prosper. Okay, so that's the what.
Mm-hmm.
So then you get into the how. What is it going to look like? And I've seen places that have boxes right in the front door. I've seen places past the collection plate. And I'm sure there are other things out there, other ways to do it. The what is the weekly collection. Okay, now how are you going to do it expediently? One of the reasons here in Columbus, go ahead, Andrew, what do we have what's our setup?
We have open plates that currently sit near the door when you come in.
And why did we do that?
Well, we actually changed from previously passing the plates around, and when COVID struck and we began to meet in person again, we did that as a way to minimize person-to-person contact.
So it was determined that it would be the most expedient way to do it in light of the situation.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, and that's fine. It's an expedient.
Yeah.
So that's what we're talking about. It's beneficial in keeping a commandment. So now we have to deal with, okay, what is the church building? Because we're keying in on church buildings this week. So the commandment is that we assemble. And that's 1 Corinthians chapter 11 is one of the places that talks about it. 1 Corinthians chapter 11 at verse 18, verse 19, 17, 18, 19, 20, all in there. Therefore, when you come together in one place, it talks about. Hebrews, do not forsake the assembling of yourselves together. They're in Hebrews chapter 10.
Right.
They're in Acts chapter 2. They continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine and breaking of bread, fellowship, prayers. You have that verse. Acts 20, verse 7, usually associated with the Lord's Supper, that they broke bread, as it speaks about it there. But they assembled. They
Mm-hmm.
assembled on the Lord's Day. So that's the commandment, to come together in one place. Okay. So now the question is, how are you going to do that?
Right.
So which direction do we want to go, Andrew?
Well, I think the place where I started was just trying to look for examples of how the early church did that we do have recorded. As I mentioned, there's not really a lot of detail given as to the nature of what type of place they were meeting in, but there are a few different places mentioned. The first one that mentions, I think, specifically the activities of the church is in Acts 2, where after Peter's sermon, there's many that are added to the church. In verse 42 of Acts 2, and they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to the fellowship and the breaking of bread and prayers. Awe came upon every soul, and many signs and wonders were being done among the apostles. Then it talks about them having all things in common. They sold possessions to distribute to those who had need from among them. And verse 46, and day by day, attending the temple together and breaking bread in their homes, they received their food with glad and generous hearts. And so I think in this example, there's two places mentioned. One is attending the temple, and then one is breaking bread in their homes. And whether that breaking bread is actually worship, like the Lord's Supper, or whether that's literally just them having meals in one another's homes, it's not really clear from this passage alone. There's other passages that make it clear that some churches did meet in homes. So that's one place. And as far as the mention of the temple, the Jewish temple wasn't necessary anymore for Christians to have to go to the temple to worship. Right. Jesus would tell the woman at the well in Samaria that, neither here nor in Jerusalem will your descendants worship. So the temple did not need to be their place of worship, but because the church was getting its start there in Jerusalem, and the believers were most likely all Jews to start off, who would have been allowed to go to the temple.
Natives and Grecians.
Right. So some place there on the temple grounds, it seems as though they were meeting together using that space.
And I know we talked about it before we started recording. I don't know where in the temple it was.
I would have to think.
I can't imagine that the high priest and the priests were like, "Come on in, boys.
Come on in and use the holy place. Use Solomon's porch."
I don't think it was like that, but it was somewhere.
Yeah.
Somewhere on the temple grounds.
I wonder if because there were portions of the temple grounds where women would not be allowed to go, whether because the church was integrated, the church had men and women in their midst, maybe it would have had to be in a place where the women could also be.
Right. Yeah, that's a pretty good point. And there's a lot of people. There's 3,000 added to the church out of the gate, and it's going to start growing, before it disperses after Stephen's stoned. There's a lot of people, and they assembled. Mm-hmm. They came together, and to just think about that's not going to happen in someone's living room,
right?
But they still assembled together. So we have homes. Homes are mentioned in Acts 2. Another place where it mentions homes, in 1 Corinthians 16 at verse 19, it talks about Aquila and Priscilla. And it says that they greeted the Corinthians with the church that is in their house.
Right.
So there you have, the church in Corinth, or the church in where Priscilla and Aquila were actually at this time, which was not in Corinth. They had moved on, but it was in their home. So that's where they met a lot of times. Other places, other verses that come to mind about where to meet. And I was actually over in James, and I'll just throw this out there. And I think historians and scholars point to something that was happening as you did have Jews becoming Christians. And certainly not all the Jews became Christians, but a lot of Jews did become Christians. And in James chapter 2, when it talks about the rich man who comes into your assembly. And I wanted to look at that passage just because that word there for assembly, and it's James chapter 2 at verse 2, that is the word for synagogue. And scholars, commentators, historians, they talk about how the synagogues were used early on that, and again, you can actually tell in some of Paul's travels, where like the ruler of the synagogue would, beat Paul or whatever the case may be. Mm-hmm. So some of the Jews were very resistant to the gospel. But if the Jews were receptive, because Paul's custom was to go to the synagogue and talk to the Jews, that was his custom. And some of those synagogues that were dispersed all over the known world, that they were going to be used for meetings of worship, where Christians would come together. And they would find a new purpose in that. But that idea of synagogue, I think it's interesting, and this is where I like to go with it, because you don't find them in the Old Testament,
right?
And they're just not there. And there's a lot of things that when Jesus shows up, and 300 or 400, what is it, like 400 years? I can't remember 300 or 400 years.
Yeah.
Here's our churchy word of the week, the intertestamental period. There you go. That's my churchy word for the week. You don't read about Pharisees and Sadducees in the Old Testament.
Right.
That happened in that time frame. You don't read about synagogues in the Old Testament. You just don't read it.
Right.
It was, and when did they build them? Talk about when and why and things like that. Just because I know you made mention, like, it's post-captivity.
Right. Well, I don't know all the historical details about it, but as best I can recall, like you said, there's no mention of synagogues prior to the time of captivity. And we know that after the Jews were in captivity, they were captives in Babylon and Assyria. When some were able to return, I know for one thing, one of the effects of captivity was that the genealogies for many Jews were fractured. And that was an important thing previously in knowing your tribe and knowing, where you were to live. So in a sense, I would say the Jewish nation never really even fully recovered after captivity. They were typically sort of a vassal state or an occupied state of whatever empire was in power.
Yeah, they were, it's not like they came back to the throne, and that was actually prophesied.
Right.
They were allowed to return, and whether we're talking about the Greeks or the Romans or whoever else,
Yeah.
it's some other empire.
They definitely didn't come back to
No.
having the kingdom and
No.
the rule that they had before.
And not everybody came back.
Right.
It was only the remnant that actually came back. So that's why when you get to Acts chapter 2 and the day of Pentecost, and you have Jews who have come from all over the place, and it's like they've come from far away.
Mm-hmm.
So that means those people's homes, they were not born in Israel. They were born spread hither and yon.
Right. You have mention of synagogues all through Acts when Paul's
Right.
traveling to all these cities that are in what we would call Greece or
Right.
the area around Asia Minor. Those were never part of the original kingdom of Israel, but they needed places of worship to be practicing Jews in those areas. So they had synagogues that kind of represented the center of worship for that community.
And I guess the question to that is, did they have to have them? And the issue is there is no commandment about them.
Right.
It just so happens there were Jews spread all over the place.
And
And the commandment was, remember the Sabbath and keep it holy.
right.
That's the commandment.
Well, what I was also going to say was to be practicing Jews, they also did have to observe worshiping at the temple. It was important for Jews to return to the temple and to
Right.
worship in Jerusalem.
And that's why Day of Pentecost.
Right.
That's why you have all those people there. They would have to venture back to the Holy Land.
But they were far more fractured than they ever were during
yeah.
the days of the Israelite kingdom when they were more localized.
Right. So they're all over the place, and they have this weekly holy day that they're supposed to remember. And one of the things that they do is they build synagogues.
Mm-hmm.
God never told them to do that. So it's not commanded. The commandment was remember the Sabbath and keep it holy.
Mm-hmm.
But we know that the question is, were they good things then? And all we know is when Jesus shows up on the scene, lo and behold, and what is it? I closed it. It's Luke chapter 4, where it talks about his custom, that he went into the synagogues. I think it's Luke chapter 4, where it talks about, Luke 4 at verse 16. So he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and as his custom was, he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day. So we're not even talking about in a foreign country now. There's synagogues all over Israel as well. So he goes into the synagogue, as his custom was, on the Sabbath day, and he stands up to read, and he reads from the book of Isaiah. That's that account. And my point is simply, if synagogues were bad things, would Jesus have used them? And I would say no.
Well, and even that, maybe you could argue, Jesus just went there because he knew that's a place where Jews were gathering. It says that it was his custom to go there on the Sabbath. And Jesus was a Jew. He observed the old law. So part of his custom in keeping the Sabbath was that he would go to the synagogue habitually. And like we said, that wasn't a command that he had to fulfill, apparently, but Jesus saw it as worthwhile to go to synagogue.
Yeah. And Paul, in his missionary journeys, when he goes places, he usually starts off by going into the synagogue. And it uses the same language. Then Paul, and this is Acts 17, verse 2, then Paul, as his custom was, goes to the synagogue and is reasoning with people. But you just have this concept of, and the word synagogue literally means a coming together. And it's like a meeting house.
Right.
That's what it is. And we know, you mentioned, who's the guy, the centurion, who builds a synagogue for the Jews.
Right.
And it's like, who told him to do that? Nobody told him to do that. But was it a bad thing? It's like, no, it wasn't a bad thing. He was showing, I think they actually say in that account, he loves our nation.
Right.
And he had built a synagogue.
He sought to do a favor for the Jews that were under his jurisdiction.
Yep. So you have these meeting places, and they are going to be used, at least some of them, for Christians. Christians are going to use them at some point.
And
these buildings,
right?
And that's the thing; it's just a building.
And I don't even know if we can say, even though it's the same word, synagogue.
I can say it, Andrew.
Do we know for sure that these were Jewish synagogues?
That does it. What do you mean?
Well, what I was going to say was, if the word is meeting place or meeting house, whether it's actually actually literally a Jewish synagogue that the Jews are using on Saturday and then the Christians used on Sunday. I don't know if it was that kind of arrangement or if it's just saying a meeting place.
I would be surprised if it was that kind of an arrangement.
I would too, given the relations between the continuing Jewish traditionalists and the early church.
Yeah.
Or just to say a meeting place. But I think all this is to say it was a purposeful place intended for being a place of meeting that apparently did not serve another function.
And it was, and I think this goes to our point, it was an expedient place.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's what we're talking about.
Right.
We're talking about, is having a church building expedient?
Right.
Is it beneficial to keeping the Lord's commandments?
And I think where you start seeing that more and more is, like you said, when there were 3,000 Christians in Jerusalem, or in the beginning of Acts when it talks about Peter addressed the 120 of the followers who were there, there in Acts chapter 1, right at the start. So you start talking about, we know homes are mentioned specifically. Well, pretty soon you're going to have to hope that members have some pretty big homes if you have to accommodate everyone.
Yeah, and we'll talk more about that here in a second. I was thinking about that business of the and actually before Jesus goes to the cross, the room where they kept the Passover. And this is where people might throw rocks at me. We'll find out. We'll see if people throw rocks at me.
I have mine ready. So
how is this typically answered? When did the church begin, Andrew? What's the typical answer for that?
I guess most people would probably say when Peter preached on the day of Pentecost.
Right, Acts chapter 2. They're going to say that's when the church started. Okay, when was the first time they observed the Lord's Supper?
That was when they were with Jesus.
Right, they're with Jesus, and when he institutes the Lord's Supper.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where, he keeps the Passover with them and then institutes the Lord's Supper there. But what led to that, and I mean, it's just a side note, but he says, go and prepare a place for, he says, go to this place and prepare a room for us. They didn't, it's just a prepared place. It had to be, I don't know about had to be, but it was prepared. And that's what we're talking about, just a place. And the command is to assemble together in one place. So that could be, we've seen pictures, and we'll probably come back to this. We've seen brethren in other places meeting under a tree, and that's all they have. We've seen brethren in Scripture meeting in homes. We know of people meeting in homes. That's fine. And then you have church building. I'm sure there's other things we could mention as far as where people meet.
Yeah, I don't know if you could argue, public forums or places of business that could have other uses. I don't know if people would meet on a threshing floor or something. But
right, yeah. So it's just as long as it's in one place. So before we get into in the simple way to look at this is just weigh pros and cons. That's the simple way to look at it. But before we get there, we were talking about the concept of a place of worship. And I do think it's interesting that all through Scripture, there's always a place of worship. And you just start going backwards from the New Testament. Okay, so in the Old Testament, obviously you have the temple.
Mm-hmm.
And I've always thought it's bizarre that Jesus cleanses the temple when the temple's going to be destroyed in a few decades. And it's like, why are you cleansing the temple? Why are you going to the trouble of saying, you shall not make my Father's house a house of merchandise, a den of thieves? You have that passage, that quotation. But he refers to it as my Father's house. And it's like just that concept of the house of God. So you start working backwards and you have the temple, then you have the tabernacle. And I will say, when David says, I'm going to build a temple, and God says, I didn't tell you to build a temple. It's going to be Solomon who builds the temple, and David's going to be put in his place, and God's going to say, all the time we had the tabernacle, did I ever gripe about it? And that's paraphrased, of course. And the answer is no. It's like, it was fine. The tabernacle was fine. But what was it? It was the house of God.
Right.
It was the place of worship. Then you keep going backwards in time, and you have the patriarchal period. And you always had, they built an altar and they were told how to build it, right? Don't use your tool on it, things like that. Jacob, when he sees the vision of the ladder going up to heaven, and he calls the place Bethel, the house of God, and he builds an altar there and he sacrifices. And my point is, there was always a place of worship. There was always a special, I hate to use the word special, because we're not saying the church building is special, but there was a dedicated place.
Dedicated, set-aside place.
Right. And when you come up, and you already referenced the John 4 woman at the well passage, when Jesus says, listen, the time's coming, and actually now is when he talks about it. It's like, it's not going to be in Jerusalem. It's not going to be on Mount Gerizim. Now, even from that, when Jesus says that, it's not going to be in Jerusalem, not going to be in Gerizim, were there still going to be people? Were there going to be people who worshipped in spirit and truth in Jerusalem?
Yes.
Yeah. So, were there going to be people who were going to be able to worship in spirit and truth on Mount Gerizim? Yes, and anywhere else.
Mm-hmm.
Anywhere else. It doesn't matter where the place is, but you come together in one place. And all through Scripture, you see it repeatedly that there's this, and that's the question. And again, we're not saying you have to have a church building. That's not the point. But you have this coming together place. And I just think it's interesting that throughout the Old Testament, and even as we look at it, for example, in Corinth, when Paul is rebuking them and he says, don't you have homes to eat in?
Mm-hmm.
And that's in the same context. And he actually talks about houses in another place in Corinth, but I've lost it now. But it's wives, if you have any questions, what are you supposed to do?
He says, ask your husbands at home.
Ask your husbands at home. And so does that mean they were not meeting in someone's home? It doesn't explicitly say it,
right?
Of course. But just that idea that this is not a common coming together. This is we're coming together for a special purpose. We're coming together for a dedicated purpose.
Right.
And here is it expedient to have a church building for that purpose. So,
yeah, I guess
I'm rambling too much, Andrew. Stop me when I ramble on.
Well, I think we're getting ready to transition to talking about if something is expedient, then it should be for some good. What are the pros and cons of having a dedicated church building,
right? Or
a church owning a church building? But to what you were saying just now, you're talking about it is kind of we kind of have to be careful. It's like, is it a special place? Well, we've said the place doesn't matter. It's just a place.
Right.
But the function of the place is special. Worshiping together as a church is a special thing and is an important thing. So maybe it's not the location or the physical place that is special, but it is the thing that's done there. It is the purpose of the place that is special.
And I tell you what, go ahead and let's get into the pros and cons, and we'll start with a con and talk about what we spoke about before off air, the idea of being proud of your building.
Right.
Because that's what you're getting to.
Right. That's
one of the cons.
Because
the
if
idea
we take
of building proud.
Right. If we take the view that churches are special places, and by that I mean physically special places, as history continued and progressed, you only have to look back at the things that have been built and even things that are built to this day. There is so much put into the construction of places of worship that are grand, that are impressive, that are beautiful. And
I would say the temple was like that. When the disciples are like, "Oh, look at these stones."
Yeah,
and they were proud of the building. And Jesus says, "There's not one stone that's going to be left on another. It's all coming down."
Right. That had an express function, because God gave the recipe for building the temple.
Right.
And He said, just cover the thing in gold. I mean, it must have shone in the light when you looked at it from it. I mean, you could see the temple coming toward Jerusalem.
I mean, in Solomon's day, it's like there was nothing like it.
It must have been like a beacon when you came over that part of the road where you could finally see Jerusalem. So certainly, it had a function. But God was sending a message to the people. This is my dwelling place among you. So it's like nothing else.
Right.
There's no comparison to the place where I dwell when I'm, here among Israel.
And if they thought they were safe because of that building, they would be mistaken.
Yeah. And God would tell them, you think you can cling to the grandness of the temple,
Right.
but it's not just that saves you.
Right.
And then we come to the church, and the messaging is almost flipped from what the Jews previously knew. Now God is saying to the people, the veil's torn. You all have access to the Father. You all have access through Jesus the Son. So the
We come
church,
to him as living stones.
right?
It's like we are the stonework.
Right, and we're described as being a new priesthood. So if every member now is considered priesthood, well, then the design of a church should not be one to subjugate.
Should not be clergy laity.
Right, and if you look at the history of some of the greatest cathedrals and things that built, primarily the Catholic Church built so many incredible structures, but one of the functions of those structures was, in a sense, to put people in their place when they came into the church, and they were just humbled by, this place. I'm in the presence of God. I'm in the presence of, and like you said, the church structured, the church was much more powerful, and wanted to make sure that people knew that. So I think there is a danger with having a dedicated church, that we not turn it into a place to boast about either how holy we are,
Right.
or how great we are of a church. Look how well we serve God by building this fantastic, wonderful building.
And I think that right there, to take it away from the Catholic cathedrals.
Right, because Protestant churches can do the exact same thing.
And it's like, and people, why do you go there? Well, because they have the most beautiful building in town. And it's like, who cares? And people have, they are so proud of the physical structure. But yet when you talk about, well, what do you teach? Well, then it's, it's just some people, all they focus on, and we can do the same thing. Before people think that I'm just blasting them, we can do the same thing. And I'll tell you right now, I have sat in business meeting after business meeting after business meeting where all Christians want to talk about, my own brethren, all they want to talk about sometimes is the roof or the parking lot. And it's like, are you kidding me? Mm-hmm. Can we please talk about spiritual matters? I'm glad we have a roof over our heads. I'm glad we have a parking lot. Yeah. But please don't let that be your focus.
There's so many details that you can get bogged down in. There's two churches here in Columbus, that are both trying to follow the Bible and serve God. People could say, well, I kind of like the pews here. They're more comfortable. I like the lighting here. It's a nice place to sit in. I like the acoustics. There's just so many things that someone could point to. I was even going to say too, here, especially in Columbus where we are, we have a bunch of churches that are architectural landmarks. That they're actually designed and built by world-renowned artists and architects, and some of them are quite old and have been in Columbus a long time. They're historical sites. Right. And when we look in Scripture, none of the places where the early church met, to this day, I don't think we know of any that are ongoing historical sites. That wasn't their function. That wasn't the point. Maybe human tradition over the years said, oh, this maybe is the place where this church met, and then eventually a cathedral got built there. That's beside the point. Right. When they were meeting, it wasn't to gawk in awe at this great structure, or, hey, we want to build the synagogue so that we can show how grand or how good the church is here. Right.
So to look at the cons, one is, like I said, the building can lend itself to being proud of the building.
It's pride. It all boils down to just human pride.
And it does happen. Mm-hmm. Other things on the con side that we have on our list, it can lend itself to, well, if we can build this building, then can we build other structures? Can we build other buildings? Right. Can we build a building for this? Can we build a building for that? Can we do that? And I would suggest then you have to go back and revisit the idea. The expediency has to be for something authorized. If it's not authorized, there's nothing to talk about. So that discussion, but that's for another study. Mm-hmm. Some people, and I do think, I'll say in my sermons sometimes, it's like our religion has to go beyond these four walls. Now, if people's religion is confined to these four walls, that is a problem. But I would say the problem is not with the church building. The problem is with the people then.
Right. You may hear the phrase, sometimes it's portrayed like this in media, the people are in church and someone says, "Oh, I got to watch my mouth. I'm in church,"
Right.
The idea of
living one way outside and
right.
another way inside.
Right.
And just that idea of hypocrisy. If that's the problem, the building is not the hypocrite.
Mm-hmm.
The person is the hypocrite. I think one other con of the church building, and it's an obvious one, and it does have to be factored in, as cost.
Right.
And just church buildings cost a lot of money. Could that money be used elsewhere? Yes.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying that it's wrong to have a church building. I'm just saying they cost a lot of money. They cost a lot of money to build. They cost a lot of money to upkeep, and everything goes with it. It's just, it is what it is.
Part of that also goes along with the idea of taking pride in a building. I mean, if the goal is building a church to make a statement,
right.
Oftentimes those are the things that cost more, and those are the
Right.
things that will end up costing more in perpetuity as you have to
Right.
keep up those kind of things.
What's the market price of the biggest steeple in town?
Oh, I don't know. I don't know what price tag you'd put on some of the biggest, most architecturally, wondrous churches here we have in town.
I will again say the centurion built the synagogue for the Jews. How much did it cost? I have no idea.
We don't know, but
Was
centurions.
it a lot? Probably. Was he
Probably.
glad to do it? Yes.
Yes.
Could he have used the money? Could he have given? I mean, then you start getting into like the disciples and the oil. Why wasn't this sold and given to the poor? And it's then you get into that whole discussion. But it is a concern. Okay, so pros. Okay, so if we're starting a new work, pros for church building. One is how many people can a church building sit?
Right.
And I mean, here, how many do you think we could fit here? Maybe a couple hundred, something like that.
I bet we could get about 400.
You think so? 400?
Maybe. It might be tight.
How many people can fit in your living room?
Probably about 30 to 35 max.
Yeah,
Standing room.
So there is room for a lot of people, and that's a pro. I mean, our congregation is 70, 75 on a typical Sunday, and so we need to have a place for that many people. We'll come back to that here in a second. Another thing on the pro list, and actually we'll say on my list, one of the pros of a church building is it's out of the elements. We've seen people in other places who they met under a tree, and that's where they met all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And when it rained, there were a lot of people who did not come because it was in the elements.
Yeah.
So just a pro of a church building, as far as, is it expedient to have a church building? Well, we can meet in, how many could we all fit in your backyard?
Probably not easily.
Yeah, I've seen your backyard. We could do it.
Okay, well, sitting, standing, okay.
We could do it. You're going to go out there. It's supposed to rain Sunday. Are we going to meet out there? A lot of folks probably won't come.
I got a couple umbrellas I can share, and that's
exactly. So it's out of the elements. It's just a pro.
To that point, too, I think there's also something to be said for just shelter from interruption, maybe.
Right.
We use the example of the upper room that Jesus had the disciples prepare. They needed a private place. It was a place where it was just going to be Jesus with his disciples in a more private moment in that time. And so it was a dedicated room. It was an upper room, so they were off the street level. They didn't have those noises or interferences.
Do you think perhaps that's why they were at the temple too? Just because it was, granted, not private, but more spiritually minded.
Right. Just less opportunity for intrusion
and perhaps that's one reason Jesus cleansed the temple. And it's like that stuff does not need to be going on in here, and that the place needs to be conducive to the action going on, and that may lend itself to, like you're saying, like someplace quiet. Kind of hard to worship the Lord when the animal sellers are doing their thing and all that stuff. But anyway, On my list, another pro I put is it's a known place.
Right.
Namely, if it's a known place for the members, but also for visitors or for travelers. And that if we were meeting, again, we're in your backyard, but if someone is traveling through Columbus, are they going to know that the Christians are assembling in Andrew's backyard? They're not going to know that. So by having a dedicated place, it allows for people to know, okay, this is where the Christians are gathering. This is the place. On my list, I have, it doesn't overburden anyone. And I'm trying to think, a good example might be, just because I was there, your wedding. How many people were at your wedding?
We tried to keep it to about 120.
120. How, and you were busy taking your new bride off. How long did it take to clean up all that?
I think it didn't take too long.
But I mean,
it took some work.
It takes some work is my only point. And when, anyone who's ever been hospitable, it's like the more people you have, the longer it's going to take to prepare for it, the longer it's going to take to clean it up. And by having a dedicated place, it doesn't overburden anyone. And again, Priscilla and Aquila, they were glad to have, the church met in their home. Mm-hmm. Another thing on my list, and it's the last thing on my list, and I put, and we described it before we started recording as neutral ground. And what did we mean by that?
Well, I think what sparked that was, a situation where if somebody owned the place where the church met, say if it was meeting in a home, would there be a temptation to feel like someone had special control or ownership over the church, maybe that they were a set-aside class of member because, hey, they're meeting in my house?
And this is, my example was Philippians 4. I implore Euodia and I implore Syntyche to be of the same mind in the Lord. Those two women who were squabbling.
Some people weren't getting along.
They were not getting along. And I guarantee you, what was the first one's name? Euodia. If the church was assembling in Euodia's house, what is that other woman going to say?
She might not want to go.
I am not going to her house. There's no way I'm going to her house.
Or maybe the other says, they're not coming into my house.
She's not invited. She's not coming.
You could see where those situations might arise.
Right. If me and you were not getting along, and again, it's in your backyard.
Right.
And I'm like, I ain't going to Andrew's house. And granted, should I have that attitude? No. No, I should not have that attitude. I should be more humble, and I should do the right thing.
Right.
But having a dedicated place where it's not my place.
Neither one of us can bar the other from being there.
And that it's like the temple of old, where it's not the Pharisees, it's not the Sadducees, it's not the Herodians. This is the house of God.
Right.
And you're welcome to come.
Right.
And there may be, and I think there is, that's a benefit. Did you have anything else we needed to cover, Andrew?
I guess just the last thing I was thinking was, in all of this discussion, clearly, there's a need that is satisfied by having a building. And if a church gets so large that they need to build bigger, sometimes that happens. Sometimes it is expedient to even, tear down and build larger if that's really what's needed, or move somewhere.
Right.
But in all of this too, I think there's also room where churches on an individual basis do have freedom and are at liberty to determine how some things work.
Sure.
We talked a little, I think we just alluded to it briefly, but the way people sit, do we sit in rows? Do we sit in a square? Do we sit in a circle?
Do we face each other?
Do we look at each other? That can be
just
something
crazy talk.
seems outlandish to us, but there's been groups in American history even for which that's the custom. But all this to say that the fact that individual churches, and also, it's just worth saying, this whole time when we say churches, we don't mean the building, we mean the people.
Sure.
So when churches are determining, okay, what is the place where we meet? What's it going to be like?
Right.
The fact that they're independent, the fact that they're autonomous gives them freedom and they're at liberty to do what they think will be helpful for them. Maybe a group does maybe they're in a country where resources are hard to come by, or none of the members have the means to help fund the building of a church. Maybe a shade shelter or a tree, or something to maybe block the rain if it rains is that's the expedient thing, because it won't be prohibitive to people to have to feel like they have to build a fancy building. there's just so many questions that
Yeah.
are liberties. They are questions of just what works best for that church.
And to that point, there are times, and I was just thinking, when I first started preaching, I would go once a month to places out in the country who did not have a located preacher. Last week's discussion. And some of those places, there would be a building that could hold probably 100 to 150, and there would be 4 people there.
Yeah.
And when you start having comments like, as long as I'm alive, the doors are going to stay open. And it's like, don't hold on to the building. If it's more expedient to just, are there times where it's more expedient to meet in a home? Yes. Are there times where it's expedient because of your circumstances to meet under the tree? It's like, yes. Are there times where it's expedient to have a church building? Yes. Mm-hmm. And each congregation, to your point, and it's a good point, the congregation decides. And that's fine,
right.
As long as we're meeting in one place. We do that as expediently as possible. So, all right. Good discussion, Andrew. Appreciate it.
Yeah, appreciate you, John.
Yep. Appreciate everyone tuning in. Hope this discussion's been helpful for you. Appreciate you having ears to hear, and we hope you tune in next week.